All right. Good morning, Shannon.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. How are you? I'm so glad we've got Shannon Ortiz here from Light After Loss, and I am just so excited to have you here today.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me early on a Monday morning.
Right?
I know it's like 10, but it still feels early because it's Monday, right?
Right. Mondays are difficult days, I think.
Yes, trying to shift back in.
Good. So I was hoping that we could just spend a few minutes talking about what a suicide loss survivor is, because you know this all too much, I think all too recently. People understand, what should people expect? You know, what is the kind of like the, not just the nitty gritty, but the practical side of things and the emotional side. So if you can, I guess we're going to dive right in.
Perfect. So I will start with like the first piece. And this was something unexpected. I will give a little bit of background about me and my story. I am a survivor of suicide loss. I lost my husband, Craig, in 2016, August 3rd. So a little over 4 years now. And at the time, I was a clinician. I was the director of counseling services at Mount Union. I was an active member of the Suicide Prevention Coalition in Stark County, president of NAMI. You know, suicide prevention is what I did. It was a part of my everyday life, really. And then, you know, in a blink of an eye, I was on the other side of the coin and learned a lot along the way, and really has changed my perspective on suicide loss and grief in general. So everything, you know, as I've learned a lot, and I always feel like I wear two hats. I have that clinical hat, and then I have the survivor hat. A lot of times they go well together and they match and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes they don't and they butt heads. But I feel like I've been able to effectively integrate both most days. So I always share from, even though I am a clinician, most times I share from my personal perspective as a survivor. If there's something clinical that comes up, I will probably literally say, you know, as a clinician, this is, you know, my clinical brain. I call that my smart brain. And my smart brain, I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what I call it. So something I did not expect when I created Light After Loss was that a lot of people don't even know that they're a survivor. A survivor, by definition, is a friend or family member who has had someone die by suicide. I tend to paint things with a broader brush. We know, or I know, and you know, that the impact of suicide is far greater than probably just family or friends. So, you know, I believe anybody who is impacted by a suicide is a survivor in some sense. I don't feel like I don't define that for somebody else. And there are people who have approached me, and they're, you know, they find out I'm a survivor, and they will say, you know, I had a neighbor, or I had a coworker, or even as a clinician. Clinicians can be survivors. I had a client die by suicide. To me, that is a survivor. It is an impact. Even if you're doing okay, it impacted you in some way, shape, or form. So I paint with a broad brush, but technically anyone, a family or friend that has had someone die by suicide.
I think that's a really good point to I guess, emphasize that it is more than just those that are directly impacted. But we know, I mean, the research, Julie Sorrell's research, I mean, she explains how that reach goes far greater than just the immediate family and friends. Yeah.
Yeah, and I believe if you are impacted by someone's loss, then you deserve to be supported and linked with resources in whatever way that is, you know, that means to you. It doesn't necessarily mean counseling or therapy, but whatever resources you need because of the impact, I believe you deserve that.
Sure, absolutely. I think that's a great point too, is that everyone's journey through this is different, and that's okay. That you don't have to experience things the same way that other people do or seek the same services, but support is key.
Yeah, absolutely. Being able to, I think you said when we were talking, meet people where they're at and whatever that means, whatever they need.
So if you're okay with this, and if you're not, feel free to say, let's not touch on this. Looking at your immediate aftermath, touch on that piece, like what police get by that and to share.
Yeah, and I think I'll kind of take it in chunks.
Sure.
The immediate aftermath, most likely, those closest to the person who died by suicide are going to be in shock. And in the immediate months, days, weeks, it's really logistics. I always said I was in business mode. And being in shock allowed me to be in business mode. So a lot of people feel like, I'm not feeling anything. And my perspective is that may be okay. That may be what you need right now, because I had to get up and give a eulogy. I had to make arrangements that in a million years I never thought I'd be making. And it is just logistics, the business of it, the financial impact, and whether that's an unexpected funeral or 2 incomes now to 1 income. I always feel like the logistics of life are really difficult in those first days to weeks, because you're navigating things most likely that you hadn't planned for. So the funeral, there are legal implications. Knowing how to navigate that system is a whole thing. So, and then, like for me, I had children, and getting them to school. I'm one person, so how do I get them in 2 places at the same time? And taking care of the house, and it's fall, and the leaves are falling. So it's all like logistics of life that are the hardest in the beginning. And if I wasn't in shock, I don't know that I would have been able to manage any of that. So being able to manage just the logistics and asking for help for those logistics. I think a Boy Scout troop came and raked my leaves, and, being able to do some of those basic things, and which also allowed me to take care of the basic needs. In the beginning, we're not necessarily worried about processing the trauma and grief because you're in shock anyway. It really is about getting out of bed. It's exhausting. Just getting out of bed. Grief is exhausting. Trauma is exhausting. So getting out of bed, taking a shower, taking a nap. I know, I'm supposed to be productive. I'm supposed to be doing something. I have all these things to do, but your body is exhausted. So taking a nap, eating, sleeping, all of those basic needs. So when we talk to survivors, don't think big, think basic, like basic needs. Even eating if you don't want to eat. I made that mistake. Where I think you just also lose track. You're in shock, you don't feel anything, which includes hunger. So you don't like, oh, I haven't eaten all day or in 2 days. Like, that's probably not good. So being able to be very mindful and aware of, okay, I just need to have something. So it's really in the beginning, the basic stuff. And then as you move through, then it gets more, okay, the shock wears off. And then you start to feel, and that's where the other supports come in that are important, because you are going to start to feel the anger, the sadness, all of the mix of emotion that comes with suicide loss.
Sounds like kind of our brain has that protective piece where it only lets you, I guess, deal or manage or cope with the things that it can. So that you can function, and you're, like you had said, you had 2 girls to be thinking about and figuring out those logistics. I was thinking Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of just those basic needs of getting met. Do you have any tips on how to help people focus on those basic needs side? Because I do think we always think that future, like how am I going to do this, XYZ, whatever it is, like long-term thinking, instead of focusing on like the here and the now and what do I need right in this moment?
Yeah, being present, it's a whole practice in itself. And for me, I had a mantra, and it took me a while to kind of get to that mantra, but so I pass it along to people and they can change it in whatever way is helpful. But it became, does this benefit me? Does this benefit my girls? If no, let it go. So every decision that came my way, I literally would pause. The pause is hard because you're already kind of in a reactive mode. So find a question that can bring you back. That is, what do I need right now? And it's a process. It's just because you ask it once doesn't mean you're going to not have to ask it 1,000 times. That sticker, I put it in my daily planner because I can't do anything without my planner. And I had a Post-it note in my planner. So every time I had a decision to make, I need to go to the attorney, or I need to do this, or I need to do that. On that day, I would move that Post-it note. Does this benefit me? Does this benefit my kids? If no, let it go. Because I can move that Post-it note and I can set appointments. So if I'm not in a place that day where I can leave the house, then I don't leave the house, because everything is going to be there tomorrow and the next day. I think as survivors, we feel like we need to get it all done today. I need to get all this taken care of. Well, none of it, I can promise you, that's one thing I do know, is none of it is quick, especially the legal system, especially some of the logistics, like that takes time. So being able to know that if you have to postpone an appointment because it doesn't answer your question that day, then let it go. Move it to the next day. Move it to the next day. It'll be there. I promise it'll be there.
So I want to make sure people get that, because I think that is so important. So say it one more time, because I love it.
Okay. Does this benefit me? And I put me first. As a mom, that is so hard. But when you get on an airplane, they tell you to put your own oxygen mask on first.
I was just going to say that. Yes. You cannot take care of anybody else. Yes.
You cannot pour from an empty cup. So does this benefit me? Then, if that's a yes, does it benefit my kids? And if no, let it go.
Let it go.
That's it.
That's so hard.
I have that Post-it note on my my desk at home now. It is so wrinkled and tattered, and I was gonna rewrite it on I was like, no, like this is a symbol of the struggle it took to get where I'm at today. So it's all tattered. It doesn't even stick anymore. So it's taped. So it's truly a symbol, but I still, anytime I have a struggle, in COVID, do we do virtual? Do we do in person? What do we do? Does this benefit me? Does this benefit my kids? If no, let it go. It truly has been my own life preserver, and it keeps me present every day. Everything I commit to, does this benefit me? Does this benefit my girls? So
yeah, I was just going to ask too about, is that something that you still use? And you already answered that, is absolutely in tough situations. Do you feel like the need to use that has lessened or decreased over the time?
For sure. Yeah, because I definitely, I'm a little over 4 years out. There's definitely more good days than bad days. So I don't have to be so mindful anymore. In the beginning, just the basic stuff was really hard, getting up, getting out of bed, getting a shower, eating, that kind of stuff. Well, that stuff just happens now. I don't have to think about it. So the more things become, a habit again, where I don't have to think about eating, I don't have to think about rest, I just do, then I use that less. But anytime now, it's more if I'm struggling with a decision. And that's just general life. take suicide loss survivor out of it. Just general, right. This is a tough decision. Like, I always come back to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. And I hope other people write their own Post-it note after they watch this as well. I think I will be doing that, honestly.
If it's all tattered and it doesn't stick, don't replace it, because it's a symbol of just the journey, for me anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. So I hear, you know, other questions I think that oftentimes come up, especially around suicide losses. What do you tell people? I think people are partly generally just inquisitive, and maybe I hope well-intentioned.
I think so.
But the questions that I hear people asking about the whys, how do you respond, or how do you suggest other people when they get asked the why did this happen, or what did happen? You know, maybe if someone's not open to talking about suicide, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and that is a tough one to navigate. There's really no easy answer, but in the long run, you know, I think honesty is the best policy. The weight of suicide grief is heavy. It will drag you down to the bottom of the ocean. So I think being honest and being able to share and be able to be honest about what happened and say that, you know, they died by suicide is empowering. But at the same time, you have to be prepared for what people are going to say and ask. Just like you said, I think people are well-intentioned. And I think it's also their immediate response, because it is such a shock. Even if they're somewhat removed, anytime they hear that, it's an immediate response, like, what? Why? What happened? So being able to having a line that you practice. For me, I was completely open, and that's just my journey. I was a clinician. Suicide prevention is what I did. You know, I was a clinician for over a decade, and telling people not to be ashamed and not to be embarrassed and fighting stigma is what I did. So to hide what happened would have been the absolute opposite of anything that I promoted. So, you know, I was completely out there and open. But when it comes to the whys, I think being honest that there is no answer. So when somebody asks why, being able to be honest and say, there is no why. And kind of what I said in my Facebook Live video that took myself off my feet is that there is no why big enough. It doesn't really matter why, because the pain is deep and the loss is great. So being able to answer that, I always had one sentence. I don't know that it was the same every time, but it was, does it matter? Because it hurts the same. And being able to be, you know, setting boundaries, being able to say it's too difficult to talk about right now. We have survivors that come to Light After Loss who cannot say the word suicide, and that is okay. But I also think that's what isolates them, because they know people are going to come and they're going to say what happened and why, and just even being able to talk about it is too much. So knowing, you know, leaning into the support that you can to take care of yourself. Again, you can't pour from an empty cup. So as much as I want survivors to be honest, because in the long run it is helpful, if it is too much to be honest in the beginning, just being able to say it's too difficult to talk about right now. But I appreciate your concern, because I do believe it comes with good intention.
Sure.
People want to know. And when they do know, so me being honest and open about my story, is definitely different. The support I got immediately would have been different had I not been. I think people recognize that it is different. They don't always know how to respond in the most appropriate way, but how they respond is different than if it was, just, cancer or an illness or something like that. When it's a suicide, there is a different response. We are working really hard to teach people how to respond and how to support a survivor, and not, even though it's our gut reaction to ask why, maybe not ask why, because that question is the question that haunts survivors for months and years and decades, because there is no answer to why.
I think the why is hard because for people outside that are asking, it's maybe their own way of their brain being able to wrap around and understand and maybe even cope with the loss. I think, like you and I, we can say, because from our clinician hat, can say that there is no one reason why people die by suicide. But for people that aren't in the field, they don't understand that side of things. And so I think just being able to help people, I think, is key, of saying that there is no why. There's not one reason, but people look for that because I think they just try to make sense of it.
Yeah, I think it gives us a sense of control. If I knew why, then I would be able to understand it and then kind of move on a little bit. Or I think suicide, because it doesn't discriminate, it doesn't care who you are, mental illness the same way, it doesn't care who you are. So when people would talk to me and they know my family and it happens to me, then it brings the reality of, oh, this can happen to me. So I need to know why so I can make sure it doesn't. It gives us a sense of control. If I know why, then I can fix it, right?
Right, right.
I think it's people's immediate reaction. I think it's a human reaction. It's just not always helpful for survivors because, number one, we don't know what to say and we don't have an answer. We will never more than likely have an answer. So it's a hard question, especially right out of the gate. It's the number one question you get. And then the how.
Yeah. I was talking to somebody, another survivor, about this, and they said somebody asked, how did they do it? I just.
Yep, been there, done that. And that's one thing I was not, depending on the person, but most times I was not honest about. Not that I was lying, but I wouldn't go there, not because of the other person, but because of myself. It was unhelpful for me to relive something that I was already reliving in some sense every day. So when I work with survivors, I help them understand the trauma piece and talking about the details and sharing details, though that needs to be done for healing in the ultimate sense. You have to be careful in where you're at because it's just going to re-trigger the trauma. You're going to be reliving that. Your body is going to be reliving that every day. So to talk about details is not always helpful in the beginning without the right treatment and support. So trauma, that's a whole nother hour conversation, the trauma of suicide. So yeah, I want people to be honest, but I want people to be careful when they share details because it's not helpful for them in the beginning. That is something that trauma treatment and that kind of stuff needs to be.
So tips, do not ask why and do not ask how.
Yes. I think, and I think it always goes back to people having a conversation. You're asking questions because I think you want to understand, but you want to help. And I think kind of the same concept, like whatever question I'm gonna ask, is this helpful? I care about this person. I would think in some sense I care about this person. So what can I say that is helpful? And asking why or how is not helpful, because we are already living that more than we want to live that. So, you know,
it's like a second post-it note people need.
So
does it help?
Survivor, it is, you know, how does this help me? Does this help my kids? Does this help my family? For supporters, it is, how can I help? Is this helpful?
Right.
And, you know, I feel like people just need to pause. I think stop, pause, then speak. I don't think we typically talk like that. We don't pause, but when we're talking to people who are going through something, not even just this, but in anything, we're all going through something. So when we start to talk about something difficult, taking that pause, is this helpful? So that's my tip.
I think as a society, we're not good at the listen and then pause before we react instead of respond. So we don't think. And so thank you for putting that out there.
For sure. And I don't think it's done to harm anybody or intentionally. I think it's just who we are, as you know, it's learned, it's what we do. So being able to just know better and do better.
Right. But I bring this up because this is part of elevating the conversation, which is what I've been saying all month long for Suicide Prevention Month, is that we need to elevate the conversation. And so, especially with survivors, that's no different, that there is a piece of elevating the conversation is about knowing how to be helpful too. So I think that's key. So this is all too real to you as well, because you had children. And so for those that are in that experience, I mean, that's a hard one. You know what to say to yourself and to other people, but for children, and of course, there's going to be the developmental side of things and their age, and that's going to vary. But if you can speak to, even from your own experience, if you want to put on your professional hat and talk from a developmental lens, you can do that as well. But how do you explain suicide to young kids?
Yeah, I'll probably integrate both. And again, it kind of goes back, the honesty is the best policy. So for me, I was honest with my kids. So at the time, 8 years old, and then 5 days from being 3, very different developmental stages. I am beyond blessed that, you know, as a clinician, I have clinician friends. So one of my dearest friends, though she had moved to Georgia, flew in literally that day. And on her way, on her way, and this is my business hat, mind you, I'm in shock, but my business hat, my clinician hat is in check and in mode. I told her, she worked with kids. I said, you need to brush up on how to tell children about suicide. So even as a clinician, I was completely unprepared for how to have this conversation. So, you know, one of my dearest friends is flying from Georgia, reading up on how do you talk to children about suicide, you know, and I think that somewhat fuels what I do now, because that's privilege for me. I feel like that's privilege to have a counselor friend who can fly in that day to tell my kids, hello. Total privilege. And I get that. And I feel like everybody deserves that privilege. So that being said, we kind of talked, and she got here and we prepped ourselves, and I was not able to tell my children. So I was there, and I believe it is important to be honest with your kids, because at some point along the journey, you know, suicide is a family dynamic. So just because I don't want to tell them doesn't mean somebody else isn't going to talk about it at the funeral, isn't going to insist that they know. And everybody is in their own trauma response. So if I'm hiding it and I'm not ready and I don't want to tell them, but somebody insists that they need to know, they may, in their trauma response, may cross that boundary. And now you have a new issue because you did not tell them. You didn't tell them anything. And so suicide loss is abandonment, especially if it's a parent. In my situation, you know, there's a lot of trust that is broken there. And then to break the trust again because I wasn't honest. And then it doesn't open the dialogue for long-term conversation, because whatever, I do believe it is the caregiver, I'm not even going to say parent, whoever is the primary caregiver, it is their role to tell them. Nobody else should be crossing that boundary, because they can't support that child long term. So even 4 years out, over 4 years out, dealing with the loss of their dad is an everyday, I don't want to say struggle, but everyday dynamic.
Yeah.
Right. So if for somebody to come in and tell them, and then me not be prepared to walk with them the rest of the way, is really not fair. It's not going to be helpful for them. But again, people are grieving in different ways. Anger is an absolute reality of suicide loss. So, you know, making sure that, you know, if you tell them first, then you can protect them and walk with them the rest of the way. And more often than not, it's going to come out. So for it to come from you, the primary caregiver, is going to be important because there is a trust there. And then it opens the dialogue. When it comes to actually telling them, honesty, again, is the best policy. The best thing that I learned along the way, and this is thanks to my friend and what she read on her way, that, you know, you tell them, you're very straightforward. You don't, there's no fluff, really. It is very almost blanket statements. You start with one sentence and then you pause, which is not easy, and you allow them to ask questions. And this is the key. Like, this was the game changer for us, was if they can ask the question, then developmentally they can handle the answer. But it's just the answer, nothing extra. So, you know, if they ask how, just the answer, nothing extra. Because just because they can handle the answer doesn't mean it's not going to impact them.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
That makes complete sense. Yes.
Yeah. So you don't want to put any more than you have to. So very blanket statements, like you state what happened, died by suicide, whatever the word language you want to use. You pause, you let them ask, and then you literally just answer their questions. So for my 8-year-old, who is super insightful, super smart, asked all the questions, and I felt so bad for my dear friend, because I don't think she was expecting it to go as far as it did, and to have to give some of those details that she asked in an honest way was, I'm sure she needed therapy, I needed therapy, and my oldest needed therapy. So it's not that it doesn't impact them, but if they ask it, they're ready to handle it. For my almost 3-year-old, as we're sitting on the floor in a circle having this conversation, she's toddling around, playing with toys. She had no insight. She didn't ask one question. She didn't even really recognize what was going on. So one thing I did not realize until it happened is that I was going to have that same conversation again. Because now she just turned 7, and about right on time this summer she asked, and so I had to have the conversation. And that's where it comes in. You have to be ready for the conversation. I was not ready to tell my children what happened that day. There was no way I was going to be emotionally able to keep it together enough to be able to just stick to the sentences. So thankfully, I had a support person who did that. And I was there just to cry with my kids. And that was okay. Fast forward 4 years, I am in a place where I was able to have that conversation and stick to the sentences. Not that it wasn't hard, not that it didn't take me back, not that I didn't need to go to my therapist, but but I was able to have that conversation. So I encourage people who know that, yes, I want to have this conversation with my child, but I can't do it. Find somebody who can. Or, I'm going to talk about light after loss. We can help you with that. Find a counselor that can help you with that. Find somebody who can, even if you have a script, like stick to the sentences and just basic information. If they ask it, answer it, and then just let it sit. And you will see it'll play out and you'll know. But then obviously I encourage, if they know and they have asked and and they do understand in some sense, counseling is imperative, because it's going to take a while for them to sink in. Like, I know immediately what that means and what has happened. It's going to take time for them for it to almost click. So ongoing support, especially for children.
Yeah. So speaking of support, and we've talked a lot about light after loss, but for those that don't know, what are the resources out there for people that are going through suicide loss?
Yeah, so I will start with Light After Loss first. So Light After Loss, we are in Stark County. I am the founder and president, and it really is, we are a trauma-focused support system for survivors of suicide loss. And that's just mostly because of my experience. I had a lot of trauma, and I think we think of suicide loss as just grief. And depending on the circumstances, there is a lot of trauma involved. And so being able to assess the level of trauma before we start talking about the grief. Trauma complicates the grief process, and grief counseling and trauma treatment are very opposite processes. So we come from a trauma-focused approach. And, I didn't know whether I was going to be a clinician. Again, I let my license lapse. It really just flipped my life upside down and didn't know what direction I was going. But then once I was able to do some of the trauma work, which then led into the grief work, I realized, okay, renew my license and went into trauma work, specifically because grief is different than trauma. And for a loss survivor, it is somewhat both, and being able to get people linked with the right services. So we have support groups online and in person, and peer support. So it's survivors supporting survivors. You will always end up talking to me. I'm always going to assess your level of trauma and then link you with the appropriate services. I will not stick someone in a support group where talking about some of the things that we talk about is going to be more detrimental, because that was my experience. And I didn't even understand as a clinician why. Why I'm talking about this. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. But it was really just triggering some of the stuff I had to work out differently. So that's Light After Loss. And then Ohio, OFSP, Ohio Federation Suicide Prevention, AFSP, all of those things. There are a ton. Each one of those have links for suicide loss survivors. If you contact Light After Loss through our website, everyone gets a survivor sack. So everyone, we mail out a survivor sack, and it has all of those papers in there where it talks, because each one of them, they all are great resources, and each one of them is a little bit different, but it talks about all of that stuff and linking to some of their support systems. Alliance of Hope is a really good one too. They have a lot of good resources, but they also have a community forum that you can sign up for, and it has different, almost in categories. Child loss is different than spouse loss versus sibling loss, and so there's different categories. It's a good way to connect with other survivors online. I would say the only warning about that is the trauma piece. There are lots of details and lots of people, which is okay. Just know going in that some of those things can be triggering. They were triggering for me, and I participate in them now, but in the beginning was not helpful. So just knowing where you're at in the process. And of course, StarkMHAR and Suicide Prevention Coalition. And again, I think Stark County, we have so many resources and so many valuable, I think just tapping into what the right one and knowing where to go is sometimes, especially in the beginning, I will ask survivors, what do you need? And they will say, I don't know what I need. Yeah. And I remember that. I had so much. I don't know. I don't know. So for a Boy Scout troop to show up and just rake my leaves, yes. If you think, I think that's important for supporters to know, if they don't know, think about who they are, what they're struggling with, and then just fill a gap. Think of something that will take something off their plate. I think a lot of times this was a lesson learned as well. People wanted to take me out to dinner or out to coffee or get me out of the house. And that's not what I needed. I needed somebody to scrub my toilets. I need somebody to pick up my kids. I need somebody to rake my leaves. My dishwasher is broke. I can't start my leaf blower.
Those basic needs, back to that,
Yeah.
and that day-to-day functioning.
Yeah.
So would you say that for people that are watching this that maybe have not experienced directly suicide loss, but maybe they know somebody, what would you say to them? So we're talking about supporting survivors.
Yeah. I would say love people where they are and just meeting them where they are, knowing that there are no words. So light after loss, probably one of the things I say the most is the power of presence. You don't have to say anything because there's nothing you can say. You really don't have to do anything because there's nothing in some ways that you can do to fix it.
Right.
Just show up. So for me, when my pastor showed up to unclog my sink, it didn't say one word about Jesus or God, but just unclogged my sink. That meant more to me and still means more to me now than anything he could have said.
That's amazing.
Just showing up. Yesterday we had our golf outing. For people just to show up, and we did have survivors there, and for people to see that you are not alone. You feel alone. I call it Suicide Island. You feel alone. You could be in a room of 1,000 people and still feel alone. But seeing that people do show up and that you are cared for and that we support you, you are not alone. The more you hear that and the more you experience that, it's kind of like exception. What do you have any exceptions? You feel alone. Is there an exception to that? Well, yeah, I have these hundreds of people who show up for me at this golf outing, so just combating some of those negative thoughts with real life kind of experiences. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that you have shared so many wonderful tips that I hope that people will take on into their day-to-day lives, whether they've been directly impacted or not. We've got 2 Post-it notes that people need to be having.
Yeah.
And just understanding kind of the maybe what to say or what not to say. I think it's just about elevating our day-to-day conversation. So Shannon, just want to thank you so much because you're always very willing to help with the Stark County Suicide Prevention Coalition and fill those gaps. And I know that you always talk about to others about being a light. And I just want to say that you are a light. And I hope that you know that and believe that and feel that often. Stark County is really grateful and all of the survivors that you're supporting. I'm sure feel that presence. So thank you for everything that you do for them.
I so appreciate that. And you told me not to make you cry. What are you doing?
I didn't mean to do that.
Here.
Oh,
I do appreciate that. It's a double-edged sword. I am beyond blessed to have all of the support that I did, all of the resources at hand, to have the ability to come out of the fire holding water for those still engulfed by the flames. And I want that to be everybody's story. I feel privileged. Speaking of privilege, that is a privilege, and I feel everybody deserves that privilege. So I appreciate those kind words. I, hope it is sunflower season, so it is all about sunflowers and being a light and all that kind of stuff. So thank you so much for having me today. I appreciate you.
Absolutely. All right. Take care.
You too.